Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to get into something a little tricky. We're digging into a sermon that tackles a really challenging passage from the book of Proverbs, one that talks about a God who not only loves, but also hates. Okay, so let's start with something we all probably know. This might be the most famous, most quoted statement in all of Christian theology. And the sermon we're looking at points out that for a lot of people, this is kind of the beginning and the end of the conversation about God's nature. And this is where things get a lot more complicated. The sermon confronts this question head on. It argues that the popular idea of God being only about love is, and this is a direct quote from the source, unbiblical. It really invites us to look at a much more complex picture. So if we're going to follow this sermon's logic, the very first thing we have to do is deal with the most controversial word in this whole thing, hate. The argument is that this word might not mean what we automatically think it means. The sermon actually goes back to the original Hebrew to make its case, and what it finds is that this word for hate isn't about a hot, angry human emotion. It's more like a firm, principled, a total and complete opposition to something. And this slide really lays out the key difference. On one side, you have our common view of hate. It's often personal, destructive, kind of irrational. But on the other side, the sermon presents this idea of divine hate, which it describes as principled, holy, and get this, not the opposite of love, but actually a consequence of it. And the sermon uses verses like this one from Psalms to back that up. The idea here is that loving good and hating evil aren't two separate things. They're completely linked. You can't really have a deep love for what's right without also having a deep opposition to what's wrong. They're two sides of the same coin. To make this a little easier to grasp, the sermon offers up this really powerful analogy. Think about it. If a husband truly, deeply loves his wife, he has to hate anything that would try to harm her, right? It's not a contradiction, it's a necessity of that love. And the argument goes, that's how it is with God. Because God is a God of love, he must also be a God who hates evil. Okay, so if we run with this redefinition of hate for a minute, the next obvious question is, well, what are we talking about? Specifically, what does the book of Proverbs say that God actually hates? The passage lists 7 things. And the word it uses is abomination. The sermon explains that this is a super strong word. It's meant to create a feeling of repulsion, of disgust, like something is so contrary to God's nature that it's just sickening. So here they are, the full list from Proverbs. And what's really interesting is how it's not just about actions, but also attitudes and the things that go on inside of us. The sermon breaks down each one, so let's walk through them. It all kicks off with pride. The sermon explains that the literal Hebrew here is high eyes. I mean, that just paints a perfect picture, doesn't it? Someone physically looking down their nose at other people, completely convinced of their own superiority. And right on the heels of that pride comes dishonesty. And we're not just talking about big, obvious lies here. This covers any manipulation of the truth, flattery, exaggeration, or as the sermon puts it, being economical with the truth, just to get ahead. Now, this one seems pretty straightforward, but the sermon really expands the definition. It argues this goes way beyond physical violence. Unjust hatred that you hold in your heart is seen as a form of murder, and so is deliberately assassinating someone's character with your words. Next, we move into our inner world, the heart that plans out wickedness. This is all about what you entertain in your mind when no one's watching. Fantasizing about revenge, dwelling on lustful thoughts, or even secretly wishing for someone else to fail. And of course, what happens in the heart doesn't tend to stay in the heart. This describes someone who doesn't need to be pushed towards wrongdoing, they sprint towards it. They're impulsive, easily tempted, quick to speak, quick to get angry, and really slow to listen. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't we already cover lying? But the sermon clarifies that this is a very specific and very destructive kind of lie. This is about using falsehoods to actively harm another person, whether that's perjury in a courtroom or just slander and gossip over coffee. And finally, the 7th sin on the list is all about tearing communities apart. This describes a person whose actions, even if it's just them carelessly insisting on their own rights, create division and strife where there ought to be peace. Whew, after walking through that pretty heavy list, the sermon pivots. The point isn't just to catalog all this wrongdoing to make people feel bad. It's presented as a tool, something with a very practical and personal purpose. The argument is that understanding what God hates is really meant to provoke self-examination. The goal isn't just to know the list, it's to look in the mirror and see if any of these things are hanging around in your own life, and then to repent, to turn away from them. And here, pretty late in the sermon, a really critical distinction gets made. For a believer, the argument is that God hates the sin but still loves the person, kind of like a father disciplining a child. But for someone outside of that faith, well, the sermon makes a much stronger claim that God abhors both the sin and the person. So the sermon doesn't just identify all these problems and then leave you hanging. It makes sure to conclude by prescribing a path for how someone should respond to all this. And that response is laid out as a 4-step process. First, turn to Christ. Second, you actually pray for the motivation to hate your own sin. Third, you actively work to kill it to get it out of your life. And finally, you fill that now empty space by cultivating a love for what's good. This verse is used to tie the whole argument together. The sermon's ultimate message is that a genuine love for God will naturally produce a genuine and active hatred of your own sin. Ultimately, when you look back at it, this whole explainer, this whole argument hinges on that very first redefinition of hate. And the sermon really challenges its audience to think about how reframing a single, powerful word can completely transform the meaning of a difficult religious concept. It leaves us with a question that's not just about theology, but about the power of interpretation itself.